Okay. Hi, everyone. I welcome you to this installment of Table Talk, a series of conversations with academics and writers who work on animals. We're the Indian Animal Studies Collective, and my co-host Anu Pande is also here. I'm Susan Haris. I'm a PhD student in IIT Delhi and a visiting researcher at UC Santa Cruz. The Indian Animal Studies Collective aims to bring together academics and writers who are working on animals in India, who are writing about animals in general, and so on. For today, we have with us Neel Ahuja, who is Associate Professor of Feminist Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. We are here to discuss his new essay. I feel like I can hear that somebody is unmuted. Or I can see that a lot of people are unmuted and I can hear myself echo. So maybe you can turn off the mic till you want to speak. We're here to discuss a recent essay of his, The Analogy of Race and Species in Animal Studies. Please feel free to ask a question to Neel at any point. Just unmute yourself or raise a hand or put the question in the chat box. So welcome everyone. Neel, I thought we could begin the conversation by having you talk a bit about the central thesis of your essay, which you, in the same way, I should point out that Carrie Wolf does, which you introduced right away in the beginning. You mentioned that animal studies and a lot of associated fields, such as posthumanism and so on, putting forward this idea that a lot of human discourses, the differences such as racialization and so on, are brought about in the same way, and that animal studies advances its ethical project by comparing the similarities to racial oppression and so on. So maybe you can just start off from there.
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay so far? It's wonderful to be here today. Thank you for letting me share my work and bringing me into conversation. I really appreciate the work you've done to set this up, Susan and Anu, and it's nice to see so many people in the audience, including some familiar names. I wanted to talk briefly about how I got to writing this essay, and then I can jump in a little bit. So I am a scholar who's worked on questions around human-animal relationships, and have, one of the first articles that I published back in 2009 addressed some similar concerns, and that was called Post-Colonial Critique in a Multi-Species World. And in between that essay and the one that we're discussing today, I published a number of pieces that look at human-animal relationships in the context of colonialism, security, and warfare. So one of the areas of work I've done has been on primate vivisection. Another area of work that I've looked at has been the use of animals in food industries. And one of the central questions I've always been interested in is, how does the kind of geopolitics of knowledge production, the international differences and contexts in which human-animal relationships take shape, affect our discourse around that relationship in animal studies scholarship? Why did the field of animal studies come about the way in which it did? And having been involved with work at UC Santa Cruz, one of the kind of touchstone texts that I think about is Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which presents animal rights activism as one kind of important form of social justice activism. This was in an earlier moment before animal studies had kind of taken off. So kind of putting the question of the animal in alongside a number of other questions that feminist, critical race, post-colonial scholars were asking about. In the essay for today, I'm kind of, to some extent, trying to think about why this relationship between Black studies and animal studies has taken shape in the way that it did. And so this is something that may or may not be familiar to you based on your location, to what extent you might be doing reading in Black studies, African American studies, African diaspora studies. But given the kind of foundational way that animal rights philosophers in the United States have made comparisons between the oppression of non-human animals by humans and the enslavement of African descended peoples in the Americas, I thought it important to kind of foreground that comparison, which is, in my mind, shifted as animal studies has taken kind of institutional shape as a field in the university. And so what I'm arguing in this essay, and although that, it's focused on some questions related to the United States context, it certainly, I hope, has some resonances outside of the US context. Part of what I'm thinking about is the way that at an earlier moment in animal rights activism, with Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, it was important to kind of make that comparison in a way that says, oppression of animals is equivalent, or something is taught to us by the oppression of slavery or the oppression of women and that can be applied to the situation of non-human animals. And I'm arguing that once we get animal studies as an institutionalized field with a kind of North American center in the academy, there's actually a little bit of a shift in how that's conceptualized. And part of what I'm trying to do here by focusing on Black studies is to raise the question of what is the relationship between race, colonial knowledge production, and the question of the animal as such. And I think that although the focus in this essay is on Black studies in particular, it's something that also connects to other forms of difference, both in North American context and in the South Asian context. Particularly, I think it's very important for animal studies scholars to grapple with the kind of connectedness of a certain part of animal rights, animal liberation activism with emergent right-wing discourses and emerging fascisms around the world. And so the relationship between animal studies and Black studies is something I'm thinking about, but we may be able to extend that conversation here to think about questions of caste, discrimination, questions of religion and communalism. So those are all things that are on my mind. This particular article, though, was invited for a journal called Prism, which is focusing on Chinese literature, and was meant to, allow me to kind of give my perspective on the state of the field, but also to introduce the field to scholars in China who may have not read deeply in animal studies yet. So that's why the beginning of the essay starts with a grounding in certain kind of foundational theories about human-animal relationships, and then moves on to the specific context that I'm interested in, which is why a number of books in Black studies have turned to the question of the animal in the context of the movement for Black lives and the kind of current environmental and public health crises that we find ourselves in. So that's the introductory spiel about why I wrote this essay at this moment in time, but it comes out of a much longer history of work in which I've been thinking about these questions in a number of different contexts. So yeah. I'll start there.
I think that's really helpful. I had a question about, and this is more a clarification though, this distinction you make between how in race studies, the human-animal difference becomes very important to talk about racism, speciesism, and so on. And is the distinction between that, and then you say that whereas in animal studies, the context is actually to kind of bring animals as sentient creatures into this kind of liberal community and accommodate more and more sentient beings. And so then are you connecting the history of animal studies to animal activism in that way? Is that how you're setting the difference up?
So the connection to animal activism is important in as much as, well, I think it's important in a number of registers. On the one hand, for those of us who are engaged in certain political projects, liberatory political projects, the question of whether human-animal relationships are considered to be a sphere of ethical consideration is still something that we kind of battle over and work through in social movements. So I'm thinking about the relationships between movements for decolonization, anti-fascist movements, feminist movements, queer movements, and how that relates to these questions of the animal. But I also think that as a kind of institutionalizing field in the academy, which is not necessarily always connected to social movements, it now is starting to have its own institutional history and weight. Animal rights activism in certain countries has played an outside role in the discourse. So the history, having Peter Singer talk about animal liberation in a specific way, and how that book, Animal Liberation from 1970, was then picked up by actual animal activists in the North Atlantic context is one key part of this. But, part of what I've asked in some of my other essays and interviews is, what about other genealogies of this question of animal activism? And so, for example, why many of the scholars who work in animal philosophy or in animal political theory haven't engaged, for example, with Gandhi's writings or with other kind of geographic traditions of that bring animals into a certain kind of political representation, I think is a significant question to ask. Am I answering your question, or were you going in a different direction with that?
Yeah, I think I was asking something connected, but also something different. I was wondering, you say in the beginning of the essay that race studies looks at the human-animal division as this foundational division to talk about other issues. And then you go on to say, well, you say that actually they're mistaken, and that animal studies and animal rights activism have this other history, which is based in utilitarianism and in expanding the community, the moral community in some ways to include animals. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this distinction. And I was thinking if that distinction is based for the animal studies people, for that camp, in a history of animal rights activism, because animal rights activism, as for Singer, depends so much on bringing animals to be considered as moral agents and subjects and so on.
So when you say the distinction, are you suggesting that this utilitarian tradition of thinking about animal rights are you saying that that's fundamentally different from the kind of philosophical traditions of human liberation movements? I'm trying to understand what you're saying the distinction is.
Not really. I was just trying to, I think what I'm trying to ask you is if the difference between race studies and animal studies, if the history of animal studies, if it is based in thinking about considering animals as moral subjects, and if that's based in their close connections to animal activism. Is that helpful?
So I am understanding that you're pointing to how animal studies, in my essay, I present it as having a lineage that draws upon animal activism. So some prior set of movements and philosophies related to actual movements around expanding concern for animals. What are you saying the difference is, though, from critical race studies? That's the part of it that I'm missing here.
Maybe I can just read it out. I think.
Yes.
Yeah. So you say, I think in the second or third page, so the earlier writings in the utilitarian philosophical tradition that articulate speciesism as a concept, in fact, accomplish the opposite of what Jackson suggests is happening in animal studies work today. They argue that the critique of racism and secondarily the critique of sexism allows critics to witness an expanding universe of liberal ethical concern that in progressive fashion, begins to incorporate non-human animals as sentient feeling beings with interests and agency. So this is, maybe you could just talk about this one.
Yes. Okay, so the argument that I'm making in the first part of the essay is that there's kind of a number of reversals that are happening with this utilitarian comparison between human and animal oppressions, right? So in the earlier kind of Peter Singer version of this, part of what you get in Animal Liberation, that book, is saying, we have seen in the past that society has progressed, moved forward by expanding moral consideration for people who weren't always considered fully human, women, people of color, etc. And kind of one of the next frontiers of this we can consider to be animals. And what I'm arguing about the institutionalization of animal studies as a field by the time we get to the 2000s is that there's a subtle reversal of that, where animal studies theorists have suggested that the discourse of anthropocentrism, human-centeredness, is actually the thing that underpins the violence of racism. So in Carrie Wolf's work, I'm suggesting that the argument becomes not that, moral concern, and of course, this is a kind of colonial moral concern that is unmarked in Singer's work, that there's a kind of liberal state formation, rights bearing formation that then can progressively grant rights to more and more people. And I'm suggesting that Wolf, although Wolf is drawing on Singer there, actually subtly reverses the proposition and says, well, the large scale, the main kind of scale of violence that underpins modernity is human violence against animals. And racism becomes a kind of subset of that broader kind of modality of violence that characterizes the modern. And the use of the discourse of humanness and non-humanness isn't just applied to animals, it's then applied to racialized minorities among humans. So whereas in Singer's model, you might say that moral concern kind of progressively develops from expanding the sphere among humans and then goes outward to the animal, Wolf reverses the proposition and says, actually, the basis, the fundamental violence of racism that underlies it comes from this exploitation that is grounded in human, non-human bias, and that it is applied to certain groups of humans. I reject this proposition in this essay and in other works that I do. So that's where I'm making a distinction. I'm saying that animal rights activism in an earlier moment was actually a little bit better on this, even though I'm critiquing that too. Because it's not suggesting that racism is part of this prior form of violence. It's just a secondary, because it is actually considering racism as a fundamental kind of violence of modernity and is looking at possible coalitions or ways that we can draw from one to the other. And even though I don't think it did that very well in the North American context, at least, and certainly in the colonial animal welfare kind of context in other countries, you see that as well. So yeah, I'm making a very specific argument about, and it is true that it's about certain specific authors within animal studies. And I don't mean to single out Carrie Wolf because I actually think that a lot of other people are making this argument, but because Wolf's book, Animal Rights, was so foundational for institutionalization of animal studies as a field, that's the one that I focus on here.
Yeah, I think that really helps. But why do you think Carrie Wolf saw that kind of proposition is also problematic? Is it because it also subsumes different kinds of oppression in the same structural move that Singer is making by putting different kinds of oppression in an ever expanding category? Is that the reason?
So I see them as pretty different, actually. So I think that, in this essay, I'm not quite as focused on talking about how we might reconceptualize Singer within the modern kind of global contexts of animal rights and animal studies. But what I'm suggesting specifically about wolf and Black studies is that institutionally and within the history of the humanities disciplinarily, Wolf's book comes at a point where there's a certain kind of perhaps exhaustion on display by certain cultural studies, by certain humanities scholars, with having to account for human difference, with racial difference, like, you know, the kind of enumeration of categories of human difference: racism, sexism, class elitism, caste elitism, religious communalism. All of these kinds of questions of difference are presented in this moment as something that is kind of exhausting and an infinite exercise. And then Wolff tries to recenter it by saying, one of the fundamental kind of modes of violence underlying all of these modes of differentiation is the human-animal binary, and it is redeployed in all of these various modes of differentiation. I'm suggesting that if you make anthropocentrism the kind of fundamental violence of modernity and say that other modes of discrimination arise from it, there's a couple of kind of negative consequences to that. One of those it relates to the kind of possibilities for coalition for thinking across these different modes of inquiry and political critique. And so the ways that certain forms of Black studies critique get dismissed in that book in the introduction is something that I'm concerned about. The second one is that I believe that it's ahistorical. I actually think that the question of the animal as a suffering, you know, as a subject who is capable of suffering has a certain very specific history behind it that is geographically located within certain colonial projects. And you don't get to that point where there is a kind of liberal concern for animal suffering until you have certain kind of colonial and racial logics in place. And that isn't something that I fully detail in this particular essay, but in the earlier essay I mentioned, Post-Colonial Critique in a Multi-Species World, that was one of the kind of arguments there. So, you know, one of the things I want us to think about is if there's this kind of understanding of speciesism or anthropocentrism as foundational to other modes of social violence, you know, how are we making sense of that in particular contexts? One of the things that I think about is the Benthamite utilitarian argument that animals suffer, thus they deserve moral consideration. That applies to a certain subset of species for whom people tend to attribute certain characteristics, shared characteristics, right? So we have certain kinds of mammals for whom you can attribute narratives of suffering. These don't tend to expand into a larger kind of consideration of species like insects. So what kind of lines are being drawn? That's one question to ask. And the other question to ask is, you know, what are the particular histories with the association of animal welfare discourses in India with Hindu nationalism or class elitism in the United States? And I'm thinking about these kinds of dynamics and how they affect the field formation and imaginary. So that's why there's a critique of the field set up at the beginning. And although I think that there's a lot of work that I love in animal studies that I want to lift up, I'm concerned about this type of argumentation that is both geographically constrained in its vision of what previous histories of theorizing of human-animal relationships have been, and that it makes certain ahistorical connections between animal suffering and human suffering.
But if one were to follow that, where do you think you would situate the ethical concerns? For example, I'm thinking about a work like The War Against Animals, which historicizes oppression and violence towards animals, and which is in a way written in the same framework of working with anthropocentrism, showing how that's inbuilt to kind of perpetuate human sovereignty over animals and so on. But then I suppose the difference would be that that text kind of not only begins with a critique of anthropocentrism, but also has associated with it obvious fixed ethical concerns. But in what you're proposing, I can see that that is perhaps accounting for certain blind spots in such an approach. But where would the ethical question then come into formation?
Yes, I mean, of course, I am someone who thinks and advocates for ethical consideration of many different species. I'm not trying to say that this argument invalidates normative animal rights claims. This is a tricky thing to navigate, right? Because on the one hand, I've been publishing about this animal question within post-colonial studies for over a decade, and have had to kind of both try to convince people who are doing work on race and post-colonial studies that it's even worth consideration to think about animals, right? And on the other hand, to try to chart a different path other than the kind of liberal efforts to expand the kind of moral sphere of concern for animals, which I see as tinged with a lot of colonial discourses and histories. So what ways can we kind of move this forward that do actually operate from a situation where we're thinking about environmental considerations, where we're thinking about animals as offering some agency and importance to the formation of the political. These are things that I sincerely believe in. And yet I don't want us to skip over the step of asking the question of how did we come to defining the human-animal relationship the way that we have through certain colonial tropes of difference. So for me, the challenge of trying to produce a kind of more race critical and colonialism critical version of animal studies, it means that we can't start with that move of saying, the foundational ethical conceit behind this work is we have to start with a kind of strong animal liberation philosophy that says it's never okay to exploit animals, because already the frameworks we have for that, if you read the books that the liberal animal rights philosophers, especially I'm thinking about Gary Francione here, who uses the phrase abolitionism to talk about that, is there's an unmarked relationship to slavery and colonialism that needs to be brought to the fore from the beginning. That then might allow us to more contextually, rather than in a kind of globalized animals everywhere require the same form of concern, talk about what our embedded relationships to animals have been within particular geographic locations and political structures. So, having this conversation with those of you who are in the Indian Animal Studies Collective, I'd also love to hear how you're thinking about this question, particularly with the ways that in the Modi era, animal rights and animal welfare have been grafted onto a kind of emergent fascist set of political practices. This is very urgent to me, that we foreground the question of how the animal has been thought differently in different locations, and particularly how those people who are marginalized, who have faced persistent structural discrimination, have been able to grapple with this question. Because it's not true to me that, an ethic of veganism, for example, has been equally accessible to marginalized peoples around the world in different contexts. And so how do we begin to talk about interspecies ethics in a way that can be grounded in subaltern struggles? That's what's foremost on my mind. And that's why I come to a different conclusion than animal studies scholars like Wadewell, whose work I respect and love. But I think you have to grapple with the way that we construct our categories in the first place, and the human-animal relationship is not one that's ever been unmediated by race and colonialism, in my understanding of it.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question, and I think Anu wants to say something. In fact, this has been a recurring theme in many of our talks, and I think Anand Vivek Taneja, who we had in one of our previous talks, came closest to articulating what something similar to what you're saying, in which he was talking about these local histories and how they can help us access not just ethical relationships between humans and animals, but specific historically rooted ways of thinking about it. So then I guess what I want to know is, when you're talking about, and I know that your work especially is not rooted in place in the local sense in that way, because it's you work across countries and so on. But then when you talk about historically embedded work, are you referring to some kind of local in that sense of thinking about how relationships between humans and animals are in a specific historical context? And is that is there a kind of undercurrent of trying to account for multiculturalism there at all?
So this is an interesting question for me, because I'm thinking transnationally, right? And then, how do you talk about embedded colonial relationships between humans and animals as they've sometimes been mobilized across borders? And so in my earlier work that was on primate vivisection and the histories of vaccine production, I talk about monkey importation from India to the United States, and how those primate bodies were used to engineer a certain sort of immune system biosecurity in the United States. So I am thinking about particular histories that have local resonances, although I do transnational work. That said, I have deep respect for scholars who are doing histories that are more localized and scholarship that is more localized. That's, I think there is more situated work is necessary in order to tease out these histories. So whether that's done in a national context or the local context of a particular community, I think turning in those directions is important for teasing out how human-animal distinctions have been grafted upon certain forms of social differentiation, discrimination, and violence in different contexts. Yeah, so I mean, if you're asking me, am I doing work that is about situating things within certain kinds of transcultural contexts? Yes, but there's also an attempt to grapple with how different geopolitical formations around the world are conceptualizing this set of differences.
Please feel free to ask a question at any point. Anu, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you, Susan. Neel, I was just looking to respond to what you had said a little while earlier about India under the Modi regime. And the way I see it, and I'm sure a lot of other people see it like that too, the Hindutva project has been pitting sort of one against the other in instances of cow vigilantism, for example, or by curtailing the rights of forest dwellers, the Adivasis, to forest resources, including the animals that they have been historically hunting for the food. And this is done in the name of environmental protection. But of course, it's kind of suspect, because you see that it's a certain category of people, a certain section of society that is deprived of their rights, and the others are not. Similarly, all these instances of cow vigilantism, the victims, the people who get beaten up or killed, are people belonging to a religious minority. They are Muslims or they are Dalits. And so it's fairly obvious that this is not about concern for animals. This is something else, but the animal is being instrumentalized, so to speak, by the government. And I was wondering, given that animal studies is still in a nascent stage, or at best at an early stage of institutionalization in India, I wonder how you see this being reflected in the development of the field here. I assume that you have followed the developments here, the writings here. Do you see this reflected? Do you think this has shaped the way animal studies has emerged in India?
Well, I'm very excited to hear all of your takes on this because although I do to the extent possible follow animal studies work in a number of national contexts, I'm very excited to be in a room with people who are focused on the question from your own geographic perspective. So I'm very inspired by a number of people who've been working on the South Asian context, particularly Radhika Govindaranjan and Naisargi Dave, who've done important work on this question in the South Asian context. So, the question of institutionalization is a complicated one because even here, in the United States, you can say it is and it isn't institutionalized yet. There are some journals there, and yet there haven't really been, animal studies still hasn't kind of taken on the same kind of prominence in the academy that some other fields inspired by particular social movements have. So I think that this is part of the tension that emerges that you see coming to the fore in scholarship like Carrie Wolf's is why hasn't this been recognized? I mean, it's, there's been, by the time Wolf writes Animal Rights in 2000, there's been decades of animal rights activism. And the question is, why don't we have an institutionalized discourse? And so in the South Asian context, I think one of the interesting things that I think about is that there is elaborated discourse on the significance of non-human animals to the national project, going back, much further in history than there is in the North Atlantic context. And yet, what does it mean to be institutionalizing animal studies at a certain point in history? Why does it come about for Indian scholars or from other scholars in the South Asian context at the particular moment it does? Is it something that is, having to do with international debates, with the transnationalization of certain kinds of discourses in the Indian university? So that question of why animal studies now in India is something that I haven't figured out an answer to yet and would love to hear people's thoughts about. Because certainly before, it's not something that's just new in India either. I'm interested in having that conversation, and this seems like a perfect space. So if you have thoughts on where you see the field institutionalizing and why, I think that would be great for me to hear. And also I take your point that the state's use of animal discourse is very instrumentalized, and it may not map onto what animal studies scholars are doing. So I'm not accusing people who are interested in having this kind of ethical basis for animal studies in India. I'm not suggesting that automatically aligns you with what the state is doing. So please don't think that that's what I'm suggesting here, but I'm interested in why now. And that's a question I was asking in this essay about why now in the United States, and how did Black studies scholars respond to the way that Black studies was conceptualized in that field formation of animal studies. And I think that in the South Asian contexts, there's going to be a different narrative about why now. Do you have any thoughts?
I will get back to this with you because I just saw somebody else had a raised hand, and as the host, I kind of feel like I should give them the chance before I jump in again.
Yeah, if somebody has anything at all to speak, please just unmute yourself and go ahead. But yeah, I think I can see Swati Lekha.
Yeah.
Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you for this, how can I put it, really wonderful session. But I just have a quick commentary. Like I was thinking about the relation between the species-specific animal rights movement with the notions of racism and caste. So it just came to my mind that in USA, I mean, if we follow the um, rise of animal rights movement with the Black liberation movement, was this tendency to, how can I put it, to uh, use the symbol of panther, Black Panther, with the Black rights movement. And during that time, they were using pig, the symbolism of pig, as the white supremacist, racist, right? But on the other hand, if we compare that to the, I mean, in the South Asian context, specifically in the Indian, fascism and its politicization of cows or bovine, there is this exact opposite. Like they are using a herbivorous, a very docile animal, and on the other hand there is this use of very, like, how can I put it, very territorial predatory animal in the context of Black liberation movement, Black Panther and all that. So can you please say anything about that? I mean, it just came to my mind. And there is another commentary, it is also like a commentary, when we talk about animal rights with the section of people who are marginalized, it's always like the species of the animals itself that keeps on changing, but their position in context or in comparison to the human beings, that always stays very fixed. For example, in our fascist regime, we are seeing that, cows are being used in a very political way, in a very particular way. But if we follow, the films, specifically some critical films which not exactly dwell on the animal rights per se, but which are very vocal about casteism. For example, there is a film by Satyajit Ray, Sadgoti. So the very last film, it ends in a very visually evocative manner, where the dead body of that uh, the main character, who is a charmer, okay, and he has been dead, he died. So his body is being dumped with the carcass of cows, the bovines, and the other kind of cattle of the village. So these two commentaries I just needed to make. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And I'm hearing a rich set of questions and concerns coming up in both of the points that you're making here. So one of the things that I'm hearing specifically about representations of bovines is the way that they are gendered, sentimentalized, and I'd love to be involved in thinking and discussing about how the very particular ways in which images of cows have been mobilized in different historical contexts, media, photography, film, have subtly gendered, racialized, markers of caste. All of these things are emerging within that set of images. So a number of people have written about the gendering of the cow, and even Kanchalaya's book about buffalo nationalism tries to connect this to race as well. So I'm thinking about the figure of Gaumata and how that might differ from the panther, the way that you've described it. So in the US context, of course, that image of the panther as a kind of predator animal has some sort of relationship to the ways that anti-Black racism has kind of differentially produced citizenship in the United States context, which, even on a formal state level, up until very recently has been explicit about differential racial citizenship. So we need to be clear that up through the 1960s, we still had formal racial segregation in the United States. So that's one of the contexts in which the panther becomes a symbol of strength, of pride, and that gets connected to certain visions of masculinity, markers of masculinity, of course, but also certain types of projects of community, cohesion, and strength. So although one could suggest that the panther is kind of a violent animal and that there's a kind of negative connotation to picking a predator, I think that it also needs to be connected to the actual histories of the Black Panther Party and the work that they did, such as developing local healthcare programs, school lunch programs, trying to feed and provision a community to establish strength for it outside of an economic system of racial capitalism that was marginalizing people. So to the extent that the panther becomes an image that is useful for articulating that community cohesion, yes, it may be embedded in certain kind of gendered markers that you could critique, but I think that the more salient point here is that it's emerging out of a context in which extreme forms of racially differentiated citizenship that prevented people from accessing full social rights led to a situation in which these metaphors about self-sufficiency, about community strength were very important to articulate. So I think that figure of the animal was used in a particular way for a set of reasons that are understandable in that context. And the sentimentalization or the feminization of the cow, that has a different kind of history, to me at least, in South Asia, where and I'm interested to hear what the rest of you think about, because Hindutva masculinity, of course, there is a kind of masculinism to that political discourse that's going on. And is the cow feminized? Does the cow become the subject of a gendered kind of rescue fantasy? I can't speak to the specific film because I haven't seen it, but taking into account the figuration of cow death or bovine death and how loaded of a cultural symbol that is these days, both in India and in the diaspora, I can only think that that there could be a lot of different things you could say about such a scene in a film. So I'm interested in hearing more. Yeah, whoever is next.
Anu, and then Rukmini, Professor Rukmini.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add something to this gendered cow image thing that we've been talking about now. And it's interesting, the figure of the Gomata, the way it's conceptualized in India, because the figure of the mother, even the human mother, has its own very specific characteristics in the Indian subcontinent. I won't say just in India, but in the current Hindutva scene, of course, it gets sort of exaggerated beyond all measure. So the mother is supposed to be sacred, not to be questioned at all. But she's also supposed to be self-sacrificing. That's what makes for a good mother. I mean, we've got this trope ever since Mother India, the movie, right? And therefore it is normal or natural that she's exploited, the mother, the human as well as the Gomata, all her life for nurturing the children. And this exploitation won't even be recognized as exploitation. In fact, the mere suggestion that she's being exploited all her life, because if you think of the dairy farms, that's what it is. Suggesting that this is a form of exploitation would be sacrilege, because she's the mother, because she's Gomata, not just any animal, but the Gomata. And that I find plays a really big role in this whole discourse that is built up about cow protectionism and vigilantism and all of that.
Yeah, thank you for delving into that. That's something that I have mentioned in one of my essays that looks at some of the kind of legal history of regulation of dairying, and it's useful to articulate in this context because it seems like this particular set of representations connecting cows to nationalism has a unique set of characteristics. And I think that what I was hearing in the other question is, the previous question, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, that was that there are a lot of different kinds of, almost stereotyped representations that get attached to animals and are making certain social meanings that depend on actual embodied characteristics of those animals, right? So we get something about the history of dairying in the particular ways in which Gaumata is represented, or something about the particular characteristics of a panther are significant to how it becomes a symbol for human sense of collectivity or belonging. And, although my essay wasn't as focused on these kind of representational questions where animals are metaphors, these reflect something larger about the way that the animal, in some sense, is too broad of a category to make sense of all of this, right? Because there's very specific histories we have with different species that allow for certain meanings to be attributed in specific ways. So even as we think carefully and contextually about how forms of human domination have conditioned the way that animal is conceived in animal studies work, et cetera, that's the argument I've been making. I think these questions are pointing to how the differences between species are also really significant in how meaning making is happening and how different regimes of exploitation of animals, and you're saying that it couldn't even be conceived that way, are made sense of within social context, specific social and cultural contexts.
I also had a cow question related to this. I was thinking about your thrilling essay on Fuka on cow blowing. It must have been so great to find that reference in the archives. But
I can't say that it's exciting exactly, but it's certainly it was very interesting to find that there was reams, so much colonial archival interest in it without really being able to speak about this practice. So, yeah.
My question was on what you said about engaging with colonial tropes to talk about animals and to start from there. And in that essay, for example, you talk about how there's this elite discourse of cruelty and how that ends up dispossessing the pastoral dairy farmer in India in a way, even though protection of cows is granted in some sense. So I think my concern is, if one were to start with, or if one were to think through these colonial tropes, then wouldn't one always be confronted with extreme human suffering and extreme human dispossession? In which case, I'm thinking, in which case you can see, the entanglement of different histories of suffering and so on. But as Eva Giraud would point out, then in constructing such a history of entanglement, somebody or someone will also have to be excluded. So then, and this is, I think, also a big concern while talking about parallels between caste and animality, because when thinking about the dehumanization of the human, can we really account for moral concerns towards animals other than from a liberal framework that you critique?
Yeah. So, yeah, again, this is the hardest part of it. I am someone who has for a long time in my personal life been involved in animal activism. I've been a vegan for over 20 years. I care, and I'm here that there is this this urgency to grapple with the ethical questions around particularly the ways that capitalist industries create massified forms of violence in spaces such as factory farms, for example. So I have written about the importance of that in various essays, other than the one that you're citing. And the necessity of articulating this as an ethical problem that post-colonial scholars, environmental scholars, that people who don't normally center the animal question need to grapple with. I mean, in the context of the pandemic, how can you not focus on this? This is a zoonotic disease that we're all dealing with. It comes about, you know, through the types of situations like factory farms where, you know, there's both an extreme form of cruelty exercised upon various non-human species and a concentration sort of organization of their populations that both, you know, denies their access to basic bodily needs, and that makes them very susceptible to mass slaughter. I mean, this is what we saw with the extermination of the mink population in Europe since COVID as a preventative measure for new variants. So I'm with people who are advocating for animals, and at the same time, I want us to be vigilant, extremely vigilant about how the categories are deployed and what histories they bring with them. And so I'm not gonna, when I see in the Colonial Archive that the type of discourse that you see from the SPCA, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which was at the time the Royal Society of the Prevention from Cruelty to Animals, was dominant in many of those colonial texts about the kind of cruelties to cows in dairy production. I think we have to think about how that was deployed, why it came into legislative debates the way that it did, how that reflected certain social positions of the people doing the talking. It doesn't mean that cows were not experiencing suffering due to that practice. But I am asking, given that our access to part of that history comes from the Colonial Archive, how do we, in vigilant ways, think about how the discourse that gives us access to that history is marked with these social positions? And what would it mean to think about that history? And we don't have a rich historical archive of written sources that can give us the history of how pastoral dairy farmers viewed their use of fuka, cow blowing as a dairying practice, and why it was necessary, why they saw it as necessary to their livelihoods. Now, Govindarajan's book has some passages about this, so if you're interested in that, that came out, I think that was published like right after my essay was, or right around the same time, so I hadn't read her ethnographic account of this, which is really eye-opening at the time that my essay was published. But thinking through why the question is posed as it is when you look at the Colonial Archive is absolutely necessary, given all of the work that's been done on the inequalities and violences of the Colonial Archive itself. So I totally agree with you on the necessity of animal studies work putting to the forefront in public discussions of ethical questions what it means for humans to think in a robust way about duties to animals, about how we need to dismantle these industries that are so violent and that are environmentally destructive as well. This is a matter of concern for different animal species, but it's a matter of concern for all of our survival as well. So I hope I haven't been just coming out here and offending. I'm trying to push buttons for a reason.
Not at all. It's just, you know, there's less time, so I'm just trying to be as blunt as possible. I think Professor Rukmini has some questions.
Hi, can you see me? Oh,
Yes.
Yes.
so I don't belong to the Animal Studies Collective, and I feel that I'm kind of an interloper, but I do find these discussions, whenever Susan admits me, very stimulating. And I had a couple of questions which had to do with the kind of relationship, you know, in response to your why now question. I'm not sure that animal studies have come to be institutionalized in India. But I do notice that biotechnology and the biosciences are very big at the moment. And I wanted to know about the connection you see in an institutional context between a kind of very determined scientism and speciesism, and where these two discourses meet in your view in colonial discourse. That was one sort of question. The other sort of question has to do with it's often said that colonialism caused a kind of amnesia, and that past discourses or discourses that exist very much, such as those of Jainism and so on, which talk about sentient beings and have notions of reincarnation and so on, but do not talk in terms of rights at all, whether those kinds of discourses are obliterated by the colonial discourse in such a way that it is very difficult to institutionalize them within any of these modern and postmodern frameworks. So is recovery of those kinds of traditions at all part of the sort of memory projects that one is engaged in? Those were some types of questions. I do wonder about not only about recovery, but things like, well, let me stop there, and maybe I can just, I want to put a bow on the questions I've just asked by saying that there has been a kind of freezing of discourses with the Modi government, such that when my children were in school, they used to say, I don't know whether you know Hindi at all, but they had rhymes like, Gau hamari mata hai, Atal Bihari khata hai. So Atal Bihari was the leader of the BJP and used to eat cows. And that was a kind of incipient critique within an institution like a school of what was going on in terms of thinking about the cow as sacred. So she was the mata, but she was being eaten by a canard, no doubt. But so I think that what we've lost recently are certain traditions of outside the institution discourses or irreverence, and in some ways that skeptical spirit has been sort of clamped down on in such a way that it is a large population of the large part of the population feels scared to speak, and particularly the elite. So there are there's so many questions that one could ask, but I wonder whether those make any sense for you from somebody who's not an animal right. I don't know anything about animal rights, that is.
Thank you. These are both very rich questions, and I'm so glad that you brought them to the conversation. So I'm hearing two sides to this. One of them is about institutionalization and the relationship between animal studies and science and technology studies, and with STS seeming to have a kind of rapid ascendance within the academy that animal studies isn't exactly paralleling. And the second one, I loved all of the things that you brought up there, from the rhyme, the children's rhyme, and this question about the complexity of the traditions and the memory projects that could be brought back to articulate a different kind of relationality to animals. So I do think that that's important. And let me just quickly answer both of these to the extent that I can. So I am someone who is interested in the science and technology studies aspect of animal studies discourse. And I think a lot of people enter into the animal question if they're activists from the food industry side of things. My early academic work, though, that was on animals was about vaccine production and the use of animal research subjects in that. So I think that there's a lot of space to do work and thinking about science and technology studies, to think about how science is both kind of scientific thought is both necessary and can be used in very interesting and radical ways, as some of the colleagues I've worked with over the years have really articulated in important ways. And how, of course, scientific discourses and practices can also be embedded within very violent processes of bioaccumulation. So given the fact that both the United States and India have these large and emerging biotechnology sectors, it's not surprising that these would be two countries in which STS, science and technology studies discourses, would become very important to understanding transformations in the political economy, ways that people are talking about bodies in new ways, and also species relationalities, because biotech cannot happen without non-human bodies, and also without turning human bodies into certain kinds of biocommodities, whether they're cell extraction or the maintenance of DNA databases, et cetera. So this touches on all kinds of ways that animal studies could contribute to understanding the ways that science is transforming our relationships to the state and to society. I'm thinking about surveillance programs that governments carry out using DNA. All of these things are embedded in media that are generated through animal bodies too, non-human animal bodies. So when you look at the very basic scientific materials that are used in the lab, often these are still cultured from non-human animal research subjects. So that's something I've worked on and written on. And I know that some other scholars are trying to piece together this interspecies history of, for example, vaccine production. Lachlan Jane at Stanford is doing a project on that currently. On the second point about the memory work, I think that this is fascinating. And yes, I do think that in various, traditions of thinking otherwise and embodying relationships to animals otherwise, which may be considered non-secular, there are ways of doing that memory work. And I think that you were also pointing to a really interesting history in which the refusal of eating cows is something that has been very uneven, that it's been subject to distinctions like, well, maybe men eat cows and that's part of their masculinity and maybe women don't. And how it's been a topic of certain types of reversals, even comedy in public culture. So the example you gave was great, but it's also reminding me of a children's story by Mahashweta Devi, Our Non-Veg Cow, which is not as animal friendly because the cow is non-veg in that children's story. But I think that it's pointing to a history that, you're right, the current political formations are trying to erase, where there was a lot more regional variability, class variability around these practices. And so we've seen, in the past couple of decades that there's been attempts to censor those histories, right? In The Myth of the Holy Cow by Ja, that book being banned, and then also the controversy over Doniger's The Hindus, that book as well. So these are very much politicized issues, and I do think that there is space for rethinking the human-animal relationship outside of these purely secular discourses, although I'm not the person who has done that in my own work. I'm interested to hear more about how people are doing that. And I'm witnessing that in the diaspora, it's become very important to rethink, for example, Hindu holidays that are celebrated in, around, basically certain subaltern traditions and accounts, and reframing what kinds of stories are used to talk about human-animal relationships. So that's a project that I'm interested in hearing from other people. I don't know if you have thoughts or examples of that.
Well, I don't know if this is pertinent, and I know Susan is running out of time. So maybe Susan?
You can say, just speak whatever you want. I'm sure we all have an extra few minutes.
This may seem at a tangent to what we've been saying, but in one of my books, I argued that you have this myth, the legend of the bad Rani in Indian mythology, and the bad Rani is somebody who is imported from outside, and she descends in the night to the stores, and in Bengali, ghora khai, hati shale, hati khai. So eats elephants, eats horses, and bears alien seed in her body. So she is roundly hated now, and she's alien. I had argued that this bad Rani figure is re-mythologized in in colonial post-colonial writing, where figures, especially Indian females who write in English, are kind of reconfigured as the bad Rani because they harbor alien seed and they are regarded as foreign to the traditions that are allowed. And this is the sort of part of the nationalist voice or the suppressed voice. Now, this configuration of writers who write in the colonial language, their rights to affect and their rights to a sort of freedom, which you can now see in pogroms against, let's say, Christians and so on and so forth. What stance, if any, would animal rights studies take towards the bad Rani figures who use the English language to are they to be, I mean, in what category would they fit if you were to use some of the categories that you have been using? And of course, so I just wondered about that. And I don't know whether this is such a relevant question, but it is to do with the use of a language which is alien and the structures which take these elite women and place them outside the boundaries of legitimate discourse.
Yeah, very briefly, I'll respond. And, I just have one example in my own research that has touched upon this, which is that in the colonial debates on cruelty against cows in dairy production, one of the very telling moments is when the kind of nationalist legislators who want to regulate dairy practices they don't feel like themselves they can describe what's being done to the cows. And they actually take the voice and give a quote in the session from the white woman who is running the SPCA, who describes the cruel practice, which they feel like they can't, they can't kind of articulate themselves. And so there's something about in this case, it's probably different than the bad Rani trope, but it's the fact that it is a foreign woman who can articulate the kind of brutality of what's happening, and in the gendered and sexualized language of it, is very revealing about the kind of structure of colonial knowledge and cruelty discourse. So that's from my essay on Fuka, but I think there's something to what you're saying. And if we're thinking about animal studies as a complementary project to feminist discourse, queer studies discourse, Black studies, and other critical race discourses, I think we do need to absolutely think about those connections, even though they don't always seem like they're centrally about the animal question.
Yeah.
All
Could
right.
I ask a question?
Oh, yes. I hope that's okay, Neel. Maybe this can be the last question.
Yeah, I have a faculty meeting in 15 minutes, but I can talk for a few minutes longer.
Okay,
yes.
This is the last minute.
All right. So I just wanted to connect Susan's and Anu's points about caste and animality to a situation with elephants in Kerala, the southern state of India, and how, so when we are thinking about, as activist scholars think about the animal situation, the elephant situation in Kerala, we think, so there are two routes that we can take. One is the native one, where we look into the affective history of relationships between elephants and their mahouts, and the broader representation of that relationship and the industry in regional media and literatures and all that. And that happens to be severely objectifying and commodifying, and at the same time religious as well. It is very holy as well. It's considered as a holy animal. But all these things are very co-constitutive of each other. And if we leave that discourse and then go on to the colonial modernity discourse of rights and legal rights and constitutionalism and all that, then we also seem to be speaking the same words as white women, or not white women, that's so wrong, Eurocentric advocates who look at the situation of elephants in Kerala and characterize the entire people of the region as very essentially cruel. So there is a problem with where do we go? Where do we ground our activism and our research that is elephant oriented on? A similar tension that I found was in an anti-caste reformer in Kerala from the 20th century. His name is Poigel Apachan. He was in the central region of Kerala, and he rejected both colonial modernity and Christianity and the Vedic Brahminical tradition to found a new order called the Order of Manifest Destiny, which is based on the common experience of slavery. So is there like a common experience or a common ground on which that we can advocate for animals in the Indian context? Because wherever we turn, there are problems.
I know that asking these questions is dispiriting, and when I did an interview about all of this, the editors of the volume of interviews actually titled my interview "Asking Hard Questions" because I think they were so dispirited at the end of the conversation. So the examples that you're giving, I think, are exactly where we need to think next to get into the difficult work of untangling all of this. I hope that I can follow up with you after this meeting about that manifest destiny example, because that's such a loaded phrase in the US context, manifest destiny being the term for the settler colonization westward of the North American continent by white settlers in North America. So I really want to hear more about that later. I don't know about the particular examples that you're giving personally, so I'm very interested to hear more about those tensions. And I think the question of whether we can begin the conversation with the starting point of the ethical obligation to animals, that has to be done, that has to be answered in context, right? It's not necessarily going to be, from an organizing perspective at least, if you're thinking about actual political transformation, it's not necessarily always going to be the starting point where the people who are involved in animal industries are going to be able to have a conversation with you. That being said, I think that there is opportunity for productive ways of moving away from the state discourse and seeing whether starting with activists and people who are articulating a kind of pleas for justice and liberation from anti-caste, anti-racist, anti-class elitist perspectives, those are the starting points for how we can contextualize the discourse and make it more specific. So if it's too much in the context of a specific campaign for, say, around elephants, to begin with, a kind of liberationist discourse, how can we try to give new accounts of the local history of why elephants are being treated in the way that they are? That's as someone now not speaking simply as an academic, but as someone who's been in various organizations that have tried to do this work, that's how I would try to start asking the question locally. But I think the examples you're giving are showing that it's not easy work. So I'd love to hear more about them. I'd love to be in conversation with you, because all of those seem like really rich examples of this tension that I've been focused on. Yes, I think it's possible to maintain animal activism after trying to undo the colonial thought that's behind some of the categories, and starting with the tension is the place that I always think is most productive for developing new kinds of campaigns. I'll just leave it there.
All right. Yeah, that's all the questions. Thanks a lot, Neel, for being here and talking to us. It's been so exciting to hear you talk about these things. I think we will just stop here now because you have a meeting to attend to and we're 20 minutes past our usual time. Thanks, everyone, and see you all next time.
It was so nice to speak with you today.
Bye.